who's a very prominent opposition journalist and politician, to 25 years in prison for discrediting the Russian army and treason, etc. It's an absolutely huge sentence. Really, just for speaking his conscience, for talking out against the Kremlin. This is absolutely where we are. We knew this was coming, but it's still incredibly, I've got to try and find the words, it's incredibly sad and poignant, and it makes you filled with anger to see such a principled man sitting in the dock with his hands handcuffed, wearing his tweed jacket, looking, this is the last time. We don't know when we're going to be seeing him again. And it's really crushing. This is one of the most principled opponents of Vladimir Putin's regime we have, and now he's been in prison for 25 years. Obviously follows news last week that Alexander Navalny, his more prominent Russian opposition colleague, has accused the Kremlin of trying to poison him. He's already in prison. And also, of course, Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal journalist, was arrested for alleged spying at the end of March, and he's in prison. So what we have here is again the crushing of any dissent, any free media in Russia. Is incredibly sad to see. So that's really the headline news. Some other very important things. The Chinese defense minister flew into Moscow yesterday ahead of talks where he met Putin last night, and there was a video of him meeting Putin. They didn't say anything of any real interest on the video, and there was no press releases around this meeting yesterday. But I think the fact he's there is incredibly important. And we know it comes only a few weeks after Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, was in Moscow to talk to Vladimir Putin over about 2 or 3 days. An incredibly important moment in this war. Vladimir Putin was very isolated before Xi came to back him up. Again, in that meeting between Xi and Putin, there was no major policy shifts announced, but the fact he was there was incredibly important. And as I said at the time, and I've said ever since, will influence other smaller countries and who they back in this conflict. And now we have the Chinese defense minister in town, so I'd expect something important to emerge, even if we're not told about it at the time. I think we are seeing a strengthening of this Beijing-Moscow axis, and I think it's causing an incredible concern in Washington and London, etc., and rightly so. So that's really what we have going on this morning. Over the weekend, we obviously had this decision by Poland and Hungary to ban imports of grain from Ukraine. And I've just read before I came on air that Slovakia's joined in. They were already they'd already banned, semi-banned some types of it, etc. So that's not a surprise. Bulgaria is also probably going to join in, I'd imagine. So what's happened here, for anyone who hasn't got around to reading their Telegraph newspaper yet this morning, and it's already 1 o'clock London time, so shame, it's unfortunate if you haven't gone around to reading it. But anyway, it's all there. And what's happened is, when the war started over a year ago, the EU lifted tariffs on Ukrainian grain imports because at the time the Russian Navy was blocking Ukrainian seaports onto the Black Sea. And Africa needed grain badly to stave off potential famine, etc. So it lifted these tariffs, which were in place to protect grain farmers in places like Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Bulgaria, etc. And millions of tons of Ukrainian grain then came into the EU. I mean, we're talking 2,000% increase or something. And a lot of this grain was meant to get sent on to Africa, etc., but it didn't. It stayed in Poland and Hungary, etc., either by accident through bottlenecks or logistical bottlenecks, or it got or sort of unscrupulous traders decided they can make super profits by selling it locally. And this has happened, and this has completely undermined local farmers' economies, etc. So they have been protesting very strongly since February. The Polish government is facing an election this year, and they had to do something about it. So they and the Hungarians, who are the grumpy child of the EU, decided the weekend that they'd had enough and they were going to ban these imports of grain. This has upset the EU, which has very firmly rebuked them yesterday, very firmly, and said, trade policies within the EU bloc are the exclusive the European Commission has exclusivity on what to do about it. So, we've been writing about this sort of fragmentation of the West, and how countries and people are getting frustrated by various economic policies, inflation, grain deals, rising fuel prices, et cetera, et cetera. And this has really come into the fore now, where you have EU member states making unilateral decisions about trade issues, which is infuriating the EU and, frankly, pleasing the Kremlin. We have to remember that the Kremlin really thrives on opposition weakness and fragmentation. The 2016 Brexit referendum in Britain was an absolute triumph for the Kremlin, as was the election of Trump. And the near, we just avoided it here, the near breakup of the United Kingdom with Scottish independence in 2014 and onwards. So the Kremlin is looking at these protests in Poland and Hungary particularly, but also Bulgaria, Romania, etc., and rubbing its hands with glee. There was a very pointed telegram message by the head of the Russian foreign ministry over the weekend, who said that Poland, who is really sort of trying to project quite a lot of military and diplomatic power out of this conflict in neighbouring Ukraine, how Poland is a Judas who's choked itself on a piece of grain. Really pointed stuff. So that is definitely a major story to look out for, David.
Thank you very much, James. Just one more question to you. Over the weekend, you wrote up the story, more essentially infighting in the Russian elite. Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group, made some comments on the counteroffensive, attacking his countrymen in Moscow. What did he say, and why is that important?
Yeah, really quite interesting story, David. We all know that Prigozhin, he's really done incredibly well out of this war. His sort of status and visibility within Russia and obviously the outside world, to all us observers, has been incredible. It's been magnified hugely by this war and his Wagner Group, etc. So he wrote this rather long-winded and rambling essay, which he put on the internet. Which, the thrust of it, there was various different angles you could take in, and I've seen some reports saying that he called for an end to the war. That's slightly wrong. He didn't. He just said that the elite was so lazy and decadent that they were undermining the war effort in the Kremlin, and that the real heroes of Russia today needed to push on and to fight with everything they've got against the Western machine, etc. And he was really trying to use. He's been doing this an awful lot. He basically likes to create an image where he and his hardworking Wagner mercenaries are out on the front line trying to protect the Russian state and the Russian way of life, while the fat and lazy elite in Moscow and St. Petersburg and now overseas in Paris and London and Tel Aviv, etc., are sort of looking after their capital and working out how to pay their children's school fees, etc., etc. And he is worried. He's increasingly worried about his position in the Russian system. He's obviously worried about the stability of the Russian system and what happens next if Putin's position, and I'm not saying it's come to this at all at the moment, but if Putin's position does weaken, how everyone jostles for position. And he's been very active on Telegram and online in the last, 6 months, but particularly in the last 3 months, to try and position himself and his Wagner Group as a viable professional elite alternative to the Russian military. Of course, we know that it's primarily made up of convicts recruited straight from Russian penal system. These are rapists and murderers and drug dealers, etc. And they're mainly used for cannon fodder. But he's very, very keen to present a different image. And to that end, yesterday, he also released a prisoner swap video. Now, this is the first one I've seen from Wagner. About 100 Ukrainian prisoners. They look very thin and dirty. They were still wearing the same combat fatigues that they were captured in. And some of them were clearly injured. So I'm not sure how well treated they were. But they were being released by Wagner, not by the Russian military, by Wagner, who are in sort of semi-militarized uniforms. They're wearing their balaclavas and their insignia on, etc. And one of them was given a pet talk by Prigozhin before the handover was given. But again, this is the important thing here, and the point for our listeners and readers to take away is that this is another effort by Prigozhin to try and mainstream and to present as sort of like the good guys. His Wagner group is remarkable. This is a group which we know has been accused of various human rights abuses in the Middle East.
Well, thank you very much, James, for that. Victoria, Emelina, thank you so much for joining. Would you just remind us a bit about yourself and why you've come to London?
Hi everyone, and thanks for having me again. Well, I used to be a writer and novelist before the full-scale Russian invasion. Now I'm also doing a war crimes research. So I wear two hats, both of a writer and a war crimes researcher. But now I'm here in London, visiting London Book Fair, so obviously I'm here as a writer.
Well, it's really, really lovely to have you in the studio, Victoria. Yesterday, I saw you celebrated Easter in London. Can you tell us about that? What was it like? What stories did you hear? What was the atmosphere in the church?
Both my colleague Tatiana Terin, an executive director of PAN Ukraine, and I went to the Ukrainian church, which is near Acton Town tube station. And it was important for us to be with the Ukrainian community on that day. I have to say that I'm not religious, but in Ukraine, Christianity became, and Ukrainian church always was something related to Ukrainian resistance. And while over the Soviet years, Russian Orthodox Church came to be one with the state, and still Russian Orthodox Church is basically part of the state, and we I think all are aware that many of the priests there are in fact FSB agents. But in Ukraine, on the contrary, church was always on the side of the resistance. And for us, it is very important to come together on Easter. I have quite a complex family story. For example, my grandmother used to work as a teacher in the Soviet times. And for her, on the days of Easter or Christmas, it was hard because she had to go to the church and stand there to record which of her students come to the Ukrainian church, come to service, and her duty was to report those students to the management of school. And she did go. Although she was a Christian herself, but she tried to not report her students. Of course, she pretended that she doesn't see them. And I describe this episode as well in my last novel, Dom's Dream Kingdom. So for us, as you can see, going to Ukrainian church has been an act of resistance before. Right now, it is fortunately not so, but it is still important for us to come together on these days.
What was the atmosphere like in Acton? Who did you talk to? Who was there? Was it good to be amongst could we call them the diaspora?
The atmosphere was unique for me because, yes, it was obvious that some people live here in London for a long time, and some of them, of course, are refugees now. I've seen a couple, well, I didn't really talk to people, but I've seen a couple of mixed marriages. For example, I've seen Asian Ukrainian or African Ukrainian, so people dressed in national embroidered shorts, vyshyvankas, although apparently ethnically they are not Ukrainian, and I love seeing that because this is actually how I see the future of Ukraine after the victory. I would love everyone to come to Kyiv and Kharkiv and help rebuild, and I would like the Kyiv community or Kharkiv community be as diverse as London is or New York is. So yesterday at Acton Town, I could see a little bit of a vision of that with those mixed families dressed in Ukrainian national costumes.
You mentioned that you're working on a new book. This is the War and Justice Diary looking at women looking at war. Can you tell us about this? What are you writing about?
Basically, I started keeping a war diary like many of my fellow writers at the beginning of the invasion. And first in March, I worked at the humanitarian aid warehouse and accepted the refugees from the east part of the country. But then, as you know, I trained and became a part of a war crimes research team. And so I started making notes on that. And the most important thing is that on my way of becoming a war crimes researcher, I met women like myself who switched from doing their ordinary jobs to doing war crimes research. And I realized that there is a unique phenomenon, this Ukrainian civil society quest for justice, that I want to tell this story because, it was not obvious for me, and it's still not obvious if we will succeed in making sure that all the perpetrators are tried in The Hague or special tribunal for the crime of aggression. But at least I can tell the story of this pursuit of justice, and it will be justice in telling this story in itself. So I remember messaging Alexandra Matviichuk, who is now well known because she's now a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. Back then, she wasn't that famous, but she was already very, very important for Ukrainian quest for justice. So I messaged her and I told her exactly that I want to tell the story of her quest and her team's quest. So even if we cannot win, maybe because it was not obvious back then, I wanted to tell this story, and so my diary started.
Just talking a little bit more about this book and your diary, what moments have you recorded so far that you talk about, that you write about, that you'd want our listeners to know and understand?
For example, I tell a story of Evgenia Zakrevska, and her story is the story of a lawyer becoming a soldier. The book almost starts with her decision not to go to the court, but go to the Territorial Defense Office and join in the army. Or rather, it's not her decision to do so, but she's waiting for the courts to open on February 24th, 2022 in Kyiv. And she's really eager to go to the courtroom and do her job as a lawyer. Her case is very important because it is a case of the killing of the peaceful protesters on Maidan in 2014. And she believes that even despite the war, the courts should work and the institutions are what we should defend. But when it becomes obvious that the courts will be closed, she just takes her backpack and goes to the territorial defense and joins the army. She's still fighting. She's in the Kharkiv region now. But what's interesting, and this is also in the book, she did participate in that hearing that she wanted to attend on the February 24th, because it was postponed, but she was able to participate via Zoom. So she did make her argument as a lawyer representing the families of the fallen heroes of the revolution. And right now we are all waiting for the court's decision. So this is, another line of seeking justice. And right now she's fighting for justice, not in the courtroom, but literally. Another story is, of course, the story of Alexandra Matviichuk, who has organized an initiative called Tribunal for Putin. And they have documented tens of thousands of war crimes. And my perhaps favorite story is the story of a woman whose name I cannot pronounce. She will be in the book under her call sign. Her call sign is Casanova. and she's a war crimes researcher since 2015. She has been going to the occupied Crimea, to the occupied Donetsk to document war crimes. And just before the beginning of the full-scale invasion, she decided to quit her hard job of a war crimes researcher and start a new life, have a home and a garden, which I think everyone in the UK can understand, the dream of having a garden. But on February 24th, she had to make a call to her previous employer, War Crimes Research Organization, Truth Hounds, and say that she'd like to join again.
In the past, Victoria, we've talked about Ukrainian literature and how it's changed during the full-scale invasion. Can we return to this? In April 2023, what are Ukrainians reading? What are the new books, publications? Can you just give us a sense of, if we walked into a bookshop in Kyiv today, what would it look like?
Well, first of all, books which were scheduled for coming out before the full-scale invasion start coming out now. They were postponed, but the publishing industry is resuming its work. But I'd like to tell you about the book which you wouldn't find in the bookshops right now because it was sold out in less than a month. And it is a book of a scholar. It's I would call it a popular history book, and it's about the generation of the 60s. You could compare them to beatniks, perhaps, or something like that, but you have to understand that the Ukrainian beatniks, the 60s, had to operate in the Soviet Union. So, of course, under totalitarian regime, their fates were very tragic, and they had to do all kinds of things, including, and I like to think about it, of course, they didn't do war crimes research like I do, but they did have to research crimes committed by the regime in the past. So this is a book by Radomir Mokryk, which is called like a rebellion against the empire, meaning the Soviet Union. And this is a book about this generation that includes, new research. He did a lot of work in the archives. And included a lot of letters, etc., of the writers and artists of that generation. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get the book because I was too late. I was busy doing the war crimes research, and I'm waiting for the books to be additionally printed because right now, because of the full-scale invasion, Ukrainians are so interested in their history that the publisher didn't expect the book to be that successful, and they printed not enough copies.
Really fascinating, Victoria. Could you tell us a little bit about your trip to London so far? What's it been like coming here? How have the interactions been with people? What have you seen that maybe surprised you, or you'll tell people back home?
I live on the Exhibition Road. That's the street anyway. I might be mixing up the names of the London streets, so forgive me. So I noticed the scars from the Second World War on the Victoria and Albert Museum, and this perhaps impressed me more than anything because this is what I'm used to seeing in Ukraine right now, and it coincided with seeing the similar scars on Kherson Art Museum, which was recently shelled. Kherson Art Museum is, of course, now almost empty after being looted by the retreating Russian troops. But even this empty museum is still being shelled. I have to say that I didn't go to Victoria and Albert's Museum to see art because it's difficult for me to see art right now. It gets too deep to my heart, which is already so. I don't want to start feeling things. I'd rather feel numb because of what I have to see every day in Ukraine. So I didn't go inside, but I did stand in front of the museum and look at those shell holes in its walls and thinking of how you perhaps understand us, because for you, war is not something that you know only from books, but you also preserve memory of the Second World War, even looking at these traces of the shells on the museum walls.
Final question from me is really, what's next for you? Where are you going on to, and what are you doing when you get back to Ukraine?
From London, I will go to Dublin, where there will be a huge concert of solidarity between Ireland and Ukraine. And right after Dublin, I'm heading to Kyiv to join the team going to Kramatorsk and Svatohirsk. And we will be again documenting war crimes. This is not the war crimes mission, but a trip of Ukrainian writers and culture figures organized by Ukrainian Pen Club. We're going to see the destruction with our own eyes, but we also do document war crimes with eyewitness applications. So we anyway contribute to the accountability effort, although this is just the writer's trip to Kramatorsk and Svatohirsk. And of course, we will be bringing humanitarian aid. This is what we have to do at all times.
Victoria, is there anything we haven't spoken about that you'd want to mention?
I always wanted to mention how thankful we are for all your help to our allies, because I really do know that I'm here. I'm able to be here in London, and I'm alive thanks to the Ukrainian armed forces and thanks to our allies who supply us weapons. Please keep supporting us. Please stand with Ukraine.
Well, thank you so much, Victoria, for coming in. It's really nice to meet you. James, any questions for Victoria from your end?
I thought it was a fascinating little vignette, Victoria. Thank you very much. I think my wife was wandering past the Ukrainian church in Acton yesterday and saw how busy it was. I mean, what is the morale in the congregation, and are they actively raising money? Is the church actually raising money and sending it back to Ukraine, or buying stuff or weapons with cash? What are they doing?
My understanding is that yes, there was a fundraising at Acton Town, and it goes both to Ukrainian refugees, but also you could donate money to the Ukrainian army, which is really important for saving lives. And so I think this is very, very Christian to donate money to the Ukrainian army right now. So they were doing that too.
And in Ukraine, we know there's been a bit of a witch hunt for so-called Moscow sympathizers among the in the Orthodox churches there. You said earlier that you felt that the Orthodox Church in Ukraine had been more of a place of refuge for Ukrainian nationalists and the Ukrainian mission. Has that changed? Has sentiment in Ukraine and even in your church over the weekend, has that changed since the war began and Ukrainian security services have been arresting a few priests, etc.?
Well, we all know that there is a Moscow Patriarchy still operating in Ukraine and Kyiv Patriarchy. So there are at least two Orthodox churches in Ukraine. And obviously right now church communities are largely making decisions to switch to Kyiv Patriarchy instead of being administratively connected to Moscow. But not everyone is doing that. So we'll see some hesitation and some movement in this direction. But I don't see. I'm hopeful. I think I'm hopeful, and I think that in a couple of years we'll just see that we have Ukrainian Orthodox Church with the center in Kiev, and there will be no discussion about that. But in Kiev-Pechersk Lavra this year, there were two services. One of them was, and that was the first time in more than 300 years, one service was in Ukrainian. But still, the other service was by this Orthodox Church that is connected to Moscow. And I think this is a good thing that this branch was also allowed to have their service. This is important because we don't want, to force anyone to move to other church. We want things to happen in more natural and peaceful way.
Thank you very much, James, for those questions. Victoria, just one more question from me. I think everybody covering this war over Easter will have seen all those wonderful pictures of Ukrainian Easter eggs. Can you tell us a little bit about them?
Oh, well, I'm not an expert, although I know just that every symbol in those ornaments that go on the egg means something, and that the tradition goes, in fact, not to Christian times, but to pagan times, in fact, and there are symbols of endless life, and etc., etc., and it's very interesting. It's an entire topic in itself, and I think this deserves, in Ukraine we do have master classes, workshops for children and adults for ornamenting Easter eggs, but I'm not an expert. You'd have to invite someone who is an expert next time, and maybe do a workshop in this. There could be a great team building for the Telegraph team.
I did actually win a Easter egg painting competition when I was 8 years old, so I backed myself there. James Kilner, can I come to you? Any final updates from you before we go to final thoughts?
There's more from the Kremlin on this meeting with the Chinese defense minister. The Chinese defense minister, apparently this is his first trip. This was his first trip overseas since he took the job, which he said is meaningful. And he also said that China was willing to increase military cooperation with Russia. Again, we don't know exactly what that means, but I think it is very significant. And also, it came at the same time over the weekend. There was an unexpected mobilization of Russia's Pacific Fleet out in the Vladivostok Far East region. And this was, the Kremlin said this was just to check the readiness of the fleet, etc., etc. And then there's pictures today of Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, giving his report to Vladimir Putin on this inspection of the Pacific Fleet. Now, Western analysts said that the timing of this is very important, that it was done to try and impress the Chinese defense minister as he was in Moscow, for the Kremlin really to peacock, to show off its fleet in the Pacific region, with the hint that with tension rising over Taiwan, etc., China wants Russia as its ally. So we've got all this going on, and at the same time we got Vladimir Kara-Murza being sent to 25 years in prison for speaking his mind.